Terrell, Guillermina, then myself, followed by Paulo, and then I'll come back in and open the floor up for questions. So I'll turn it over to you, Robert.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all and to have the opportunity to spend this time together this morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is for you, wherever you are, to spend time with Paulo's wonderful book. So since I have the somewhat intimidating task of being the first one to talk, I thought I wanted to be sure to start by just taking a minute or two just to tell you all about why I love Paulo's book. Okay. So one of the things I love about this book is that you often read people preaching for epistemological pluralism. But preaching for epistemological pluralism is something different from actually practicing it yourself in your own work, right? And so as I was rereading this book and going through the different chapters that are written in a cold, a warm, and a hot fashion, I was just struck by how pleasurable it is to read a work that comes at you from so many different directions. Because the way I responded as I was reading each of those chapters, I had a little column down the side of my page as I was writing down my reactions. And my reactions look totally different in one chapter than they do in another. They're different types of reactions. Sometimes I'm reacting to word choices. What is it about Paulo and the word mainstream? Why is it so powerful and essential for him? And so on. At other points, I'm looking at the way he chooses to deploy comparison. But at other points, I'm thinking about my own childhood, my earliest memories of the Falklands War, and those kinds of things, right? So the range of intellectual responses that are produced by the work in me as a reader kind of taught me that epistemological pluralism is desirable, not only because of pluralism, but also because of pleasure. And it does create a certain kind of intellectual experience that I was profoundly enjoyed. So that's the first point I wanted to make by way of grounding my comments in my appreciation for Paulo's achievement in the work. So the challenge that such a variegated set of responses creates is, well, which of them do I silence and which of them do I highlight in the remaining, 7 minutes that I'm supposed to talk for or not, right? There are enough of them that I could have, prepared an hour-long lecture of comment and critique on Paulo Ravecca's Politics of Political Science. So in thinking about what to prioritize, I thought about the model of what Paulo does himself, where he models the possibility of explicitly avowing his love for political science at the same time in the midst of passionate critique of political science at the same time. So having highlighted that, I hope he will take it as a measure of appreciation that I am going to focus the remainder of my remarks on a critical question about the book's framing rather than further appreciation of the many details that I could go on to if I had more time. Okay, so that's my introduction to a critique, or perhaps this is just an anxiety on my part. So chapter 1, page 16, the start of the book declares that at the theoretical point of departure of this book is that knowledge is political. Knowledge is political being italicized. Then when we get to chapter 5, as the book begins to bring itself together and wrap up, we're told on page 209, again in italics, that knowledge and power are inseparable. So I wanted to juxtapose these two italicized phrases because I'm struck by the fact that the second phrase, knowledge and power are inseparable, just leads me to nod my head and affirm and go, yes, of course, totally right. But the first formulation, that knowledge is political, leaves me feeling profoundly anxious. And so I wanted to dig into that anxiety and what it might tell us about the difference between perhaps a critical politics of political science and a liberal politics of political science. And I should self-confess to being an unreconstructed liberal as I go further into these comments, which will probably inform some of you as you see what I proceed to do in my next couple of steps. So the formulation knowledge is political reads in terms of the language that was used as if it's just a descriptive formulation, right? But that doesn't seem quite right, given what the book itself does and show, right? So Paulo shows us how certain knowledge claims are depoliticized in certain times and places by political scientists. And so those claims are treated as an objective truth, a given, something that cannot be plausibly questioned by any rational individual. If you were to question those claims, then you would be beyond the pale of a political science classroom, right? So certain forms of knowledge can be depoliticized or politicized in different settings. So we might view the claim that knowledge is political as a prescription that knowledge should be viewed as political anywhere and always, even when it's being presented as apolitical. So that's a potential reading of what the book's prescription would be. But I'm still not comfortable because I want to qualify the phrase, perhaps because I'm a liberal. And so I want to insert knowledge should be viewed as potentially political, and then suggest that there is an onus on us to critically reflect on when and where we should treat knowledge as political, and when and where we perhaps have an obligation to depoliticize knowledge claims. And that is part of our role as political scientists in relationship to our broader societies. So perhaps I talk here out of the, I think trauma is too strong a word, but it's been a pretty destabilizing last 5 years to live in the United States. And I've been profoundly shocked by the challenges to what strike me as just statements of knowledge, right? The COVID vaccine works. I want to take that as an apolitical statement, right? Climate change is happening and is promoted by human activities. I want to take that as just a knowledge claim. The 2020 election was won by Joe Biden. I want to take that as a knowledge claim, right? I don't want these claims to be politicized. I want them actually to be depoliticized. I want my society to take them as given facts. And I feel like as a political scientist, if a student comes into my classroom and treats the outcome of the election of 2020 as a contestable, politicized matter, then it's my obligation to actually try to depoliticize it in the classroom by saying, well, no, actually, that is not the case. To use the power that I wield as a professor, recognizing that knowledge and power are inseparable, in order to actively try to depoliticize certain claims that may be made. So these experiences lead me to wonder about the politics of political science, how we practice the politics of political science, whether we should practice it with a presumption, a prescriptive presumption that the goal should anywhere and always be to call for the politicization of things that have been treated as apolitical, or whether we should have a moderate, in a liberal, not too hot, not too cold kind of stance, that sometimes our role should be to politicize that which has been treated as apolitical. But sometimes perhaps we have a role and a responsibility to depoliticize things, even though we know in our hearts that they could be politicized, but we don't want them to be. We think we would be safer from those anxieties that trouble us in a world in which those claims were not taken as political. So those are my kind of broad framing anxieties, and then that leads into particular thoughts about how you treat some of the figures that you're talking about in Uruguay, how you write about the choice of the founding generation in Uruguay to essentially treat liberal democracy as a given that cannot be questioned, and your stance seems to be explicitly one of criticism of that. But one could imagine writing the same history from a liberal stance that would actually affirm the choice of that generation to act in the way they did. So in these remarks, I hope to bring out the idea that the category of politics of political science, PPS, and I was struck by how much you liked that formulation. It appeared like 40 times in chapter 2, sometimes as an object, sometimes as a subject, doing all kinds of amazing linguistic things in the course of that chapter. And I wanted to make a push for pluralizing the politics of political science, to think about what work on the politics of political science might look like and how it might differ if written from a critical or from a self-reflexively liberal standpoint. How did I do time-wise, Emily?
You did just fine. Yeah, it came in right at 10 minutes by my computer clock. Well done.
Well, I think that's enough for me for now. I want to hear what everybody else has to say. I'm going to turn my mic off to make sure I don't have any background noise come through, and I'll look forward to hearing the others' reflections.
Thank you, Robert. Thibaud, you're next up. Is everything working on your end now, you think?
I do hope so. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Robert, for the comments, which echo some of the things that I would have said. But considering I had a wide range of remarks, I have no problem with switching to other bits that I had in mind. So, well, let me first say that I'm really glad to have the chance to discuss Paulo's book, not only because I'm also a fan of the roundtable format, but also because, well, we should have had this conversation a year ago. So I read the book then, and I reread it this time, and giving me so much more of an impetus for discussing it. So anyway, I will say first that in my view, the book has two great qualities that make it somewhat distinctive from other works that exist in the history of political science. The first, of course, being that it takes nothing for granted, in the sense that it's relentlessly critical. It seems. It's of course critical of let's say the canonical history of political science, which links more or less explicitly the development of political science to that of democracy, meaning that in this view, political science would be unable to develop in non-democratic contexts. But I think Paulo brings compelling evidence that this link is pure fiction, notably in the case of Chile, where what he calls an authoritarian political science was developed. And I'll come back to that later. The book also shows, of course, that both a democratic and authoritarian development of political science may somewhat converge in a discipline that eventually has common traits in a way, in a discipline that supports implicitly or more or less explicitly forms of neoliberalism, but from very different national trajectories. I found that very interesting and powerful as an argument. To achieve this, of course, Paulo relies extensively on critical approaches of all kinds. So he draws on gender theory, post-colonial approaches, but also more classical authors like Nietzsche, Marx, the Frankfurt School, etc. But the book does not stop there, because Paulo is not satisfied either with critical approaches themselves. And the book is also critical of critical approaches and wonders whether we can indeed produce a truly critical emancipatory discourse when the development of critical approaches themselves have been closely linked to to their institutionalization in dominant Western Northern institutions. And he also points out that critical approaches themselves have played a role in the advent of neoliberalism. So in a way, the book never stops thinking. And I found that very powerful. This brings me to what I think is the second quality or strength of the book, which is its very sophisticated character at the epistemological level. Let's say it's bold from an epistemological standpoint. It's almost an epistemological manifesto. As Robert was talking about, the book mixes chapters based on objective and subjective data, and so it is sometimes cold, sometimes warm, sometimes hot. And in that sense, it's both scientific in the very positivist sense of the word, but also, I think, relentlessly human as it seeks to empathize with many of its protagonists. I think this goes beyond what has been termed, again in a somewhat positivist way, mixed methods. There's much more, I think, feeling in there, much more reflexivity, and it gives, I think, a certain force, a certain power to Paulo's narrative. The hot part, of course, is very difficult to comment upon, because I think it's hard to strike the right tone between commenting on personal experiences and commenting on their analytical value. But I found it very relevant in a way, because when I was reading this chapter, I thought inevitably, I guess, about my own experience and about the way I myself came to be interested in the history of political science. And it turns out that I came from a very different sort of trajectory. I was more of a positivist when I came to political science, because I was a math major in high school. And when I discovered political science at university level, I didn't quite understand how this could be called a science when it clearly didn't have the same, what I thought of as the same beautiful rigor as math. So that got me progressively interested in the epistemology, history of, and sociology of political science. Anyway, my point is not to talk about myself, but to say that Paulo's stance gets us to think about where histories of political science may come from intellectually, and therefore what the hidden agenda, in a way, of such studies may be. Now, that being said, I do have quite a few questions or more critical remarks that I would like to ask. Paulo. And again, it's not a criticism of the book as such. It's more for the sake of discussing its value with all of you. As I said, one of the book's added value is its epistemological stance. But at the same time, I cannot help but feel that there is a bit of an issue with using different temperatures to study different countries in a way. I wonder whether it wouldn't be better or more heuristic to sort of apply these different temperatures to one and the same case. In that sense, I feel that compared to the Uruguay case, the Chilean one feels much colder. In that sense, I missed in the Chilean case some kind of empathy. What I mean by that is that compared to Uruguayan political scientists, Chilean ones in the book feel a bit more like robots in a way, or or more sort of decontextualized scholars. So yeah, I think there's a bit of an asymmetry, if you like, in the book in that sense. Empirically, I wondered, reading the book, whether it made sense to design such an overarching category as authoritarian political science, or APS. It does have the virtue of hammering the key message that, as I said earlier, political science is not necessarily a byproduct of democracy, but it does convey the idea that whatever that APS may be a coherent unit that would be pretty much the same in different national contexts, so that even would be coherent internally. The book does point out at some point that there is a mixture of discursive logics within authoritarian political science, which tends to go in the direction that I'm pointing to. But I still feel that the depiction of the internal structure of APS is, to me, one of the weaker points of the argument. One last bit, and then I'll stop. At the theoretical level, I couldn't help but feel that there was a bit of a risk as well to play with all these massive authors that you rely on, to lean on sometimes what is a minor point of their work. I feel there was a bit of an intellectual personal history there that you wanted to trace, as much as there was a purpose of building a theoretical framework for the book. But I wonder whether it wouldn't have been more cautious in a way to make this point that knowledge has a political dimension without this very heavy theoretical apparatus. Anyway, I've gone beyond my 10 minutes, so I'll stop here and thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion that will come next.
Thanks, Thibaud. Terrell, you're next.
Okay, thanks very much. It's delightful to be here this afternoon and to celebrate Paulo's book. I'm going to come at it quite a different way from my two distinguished predecessors, and I hope people enjoy the contrast. And I love the book. This is a genre-busting book. It's not a place to avoid risk and be cautious. And I thoroughly love it for that reason. I'm looking at the first page of chapter 1, and the first sentence is, and I quote, "Knowledge is a battlefield," unquote. So I think that's a brilliant bit of scene setting. And I do like thinking and books that are interventions and which are challenging and deliberately challenging and indeed upsetting. So maybe this is not a good thing, but when I've come into a classroom or a Zoom screen, I'm hoping and praying that people are going to be uncomfortable. Not to the point of having breakdowns and serious problems, but I just find it impossible to start a sentence saying, you know, I'm here to make you comfortable, or I hope you're all comfortable, because that is, I think, covering over how human beings really are. And I'll come back to that by the time we get to the end of this little intervention. So if we look at the title, The Politics of Political Science, what I wanted to focus on wasn't political science, but science. And that has been raised. And the purity of mathematics as a way of understanding and explicating what is meant or intended to be meant within that concept is very interesting. Actually, a lot of what is grouped disciplinarily under science is quite messy, not very predictive, very historical, doesn't rely on repetition or indeed necessarily very much mathematics any more than the rest of us do. So I think there's wrapped up in the concept of science for most people as they have learned it, which is the way philosophers of science have wanted us to learn it, is often a realm of purity. So various other well-known binary distinctions seem therefore to follow. Namely, it is in itself, it can be political or not. It is depoliticized. It's upsetting to try to make it political. I'm in a discussion group with a couple of scientists who get quite upset when I point out how imbricated all of their activities are with the agendas of funders and foundations, not to mention governments, and any number of other things. And sometimes it's the Mrs. Scientist, quote unquote, who pokes the Mr. Scientist in the ribs and says, well, just think about what you were doing this morning. So there are various reality checks that go in with that one, but I'm going to go historical at the moment. And back to science and political studies getting together so closely. We have only 2 or 3, I think, political science departments in as such in the UK, and most of us are still in a political studies zone, as is the professional association. And the journal of that association, etc., etc. So this is a little bit of a refuge place if you want to get away from this kind of imbrication or definitional configuration or conflation of science and politics, political studies coming out as political science. So if we get a bit historical, I can go back to the early 1960s, and a certain kind of narrative that developed, which you may or may not have ever heard of, which was that, and I associate this with the late David Easton, although I haven't gone back to look it up, but a speculative zone, or indeed a political project, that political scientists with their scientific specialist knowledge really ought to be depoliticized, but as experts to be super advisors attached to the United Nations to advise the nations of the world and the peoples thereof on how to run themselves properly. And that they would have special United Nations passports and denationalize themselves as well, which I thought at the time was, rather an airy-fairy idea, but I thought, well, being a student, if that's the way these people see it, then I guess I can think about that. Anyway, maybe I would ascend to that kind of level, but actually I chose to go to Oxford instead of Yale, which was a much better option for me anyway. Moreover, in this kind of vision of the magical world of purely objective political scientists, they were also going to be disembodied. As well as denationalized. There were going to be minds who would float around in one of those sci-fi think tanks where, the brain is there sort of having great thoughts with no body, and that would reinforce their objectivity because they wouldn't have to deal in any way with normal human social relationships, which are, as feminism, for instance, was coming in with, well, you just can't make that kind of distinction between the public and the private. But we hadn't quite got there yet, at least some people had, but they weren't as well known then as now, and indeed they probably couldn't have got published. So this is to say that all of it is still going on, more or less, in the word science, and the way that people who study politics and also engage in politics, at least at the level of classroom contestation, think of themselves, or like to think of themselves, as a little bit over and above these kinds of things, or at least that they ought to be able to avail themselves of a distinction when they feel like it. And I think this book is saying no. I think this book is saying you are an embodied person. You are already within social relations. There is no way of magically floating yourself above it to this realm that did get a little traction quite a long time ago. And so the thing that this book does is to show how within that realm it's then easy to become a weapon, rather the way that scientists find it quite easy and well funded to produce technologies that eventually go into weaponry, even if they don't bother to consider exactly what happens along the chain of supply and sale. And the book, I mean, the point for me of going to Latin America was to show how weaponized it became. And if the Chilean political scientists seem cold and robotic, that's probably a fair enough take with what was going on. As we know, Uruguay is a nice, warm sort of liberal-seeming place at various times, and so I mean the cultures and histories of these places are going to be different, and so are the political scientists who are there, and so are the different kinds of things they are going to be recruited to, or excluded from, or the kinds of projects they're going to be involved in. And so too are the different kinds of fate in terms of their career trajectories. So I think that's, for me, the battlefield character of the book that really comes across, which doesn't prove that political scientists, whether liberal or positivist or any other sort of epistemological flavor, are automatically participating in that, but rather that one has to think carefully before drawing some kind of magic circle around oneself and thinking that it's all going on somewhere else. So that can be applied in various ways in various countries, I mean, not least in the United States at times. And this is not really to bring up any particular incidents, but that the politics of departments where things are already political, and in particular the politics of departments whose business is politics. I think one needs to watch the term science and how it's invoked and what it means very carefully. So I love the epigraph, and I'll close on this since I'm going to read it out, slightly abridged, but it's very striking. The epigraph above the sentence, knowledge is battlefield, comes from Marx, or at least Marx in translation, and is edited, I think, from the 1844 so-called manuscripts. But anyway, as a text, it says, and he's speaking of himself in a self-reflexive way, when I am active scientifically, wissenschaftlich, etc., when I am engaged in activity of which I can seldom perform in direct community with others, so he is rather regretfully operating within his head in this self-reflection. He says, then I am social because I am active as a human. Not only is the material of my activity given to me as a social product, as is even the language in which the thinker is active, such as science, my own existence is social activity, and therefore that which I make of myself. As a project, I make of myself for society and with the consciousness of myself as a social being. So that, I think, is exactly what's going on in quite a wonderful way in this book. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Terrell. Guillermina?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to read for the sake of time, and I'm going to time myself. I really like this book. We have traveled together. It has stayed with me during the pandemic, and I keep learning from it. The book first presents us with a tight, filigreed web of relations of power and knowledge that shapes our institutions, practices, and souls. Reading ourselves within these coordinates seems essential, not to become mere instruments of power, Paulo tells us. The politics political science brings together epistemology, political science, politics, and autoethnography to interpellate us at multiple levels and force us our self-reflection. And what self-reflection offers to us is the possibility to free ourselves from reproducing hegemonic forms of domination. From the start, reading this book helped me to understand the exclusions I've seen and experienced, while forcing me to interrogate my own role in enacting and reproducing them. Thus, revisiting the politics of political science with Paulo becomes a fascinating, challenging, and painful exercise with cutting questions that leave no corners for us to hide. Reading the book can be painful too, as Paulo acknowledges when he invites us to explore the productive aspects of the powers that hurt. There are a number of things that I would like to discuss, and I really enjoyed the previous presentations, but it wasn't my choice, however, that two lines kept coming back to mind. When discussing Chile's Pinochet on page 81, Paulo writes, quote, "The regime killed and thought at the same time, and of course it killed thought as well. At times," he adds, "killing and thinking were done by the same people." So I'm trying to figure out why and how these lines impacted me, and I have a few questions. And so briefly, in terms of temperatures, reading and rereading this book has been a very hot experience, and even the coldest moments feel really hot. So basically, my main question is about the reach of the argument and its claims, and then I have also questions and comments about the ways in which democracy and political science imagine each other and together and themselves, and the kinds of thinking, killing, and unthinking that they do together, some sort of a genealogy. So this took me back to 1974, to a letter that André Gunder Frank, one of the main voices of dependency theory, writes, an open letter that he writes to Milton Friedman, his former advisor at the University of Chicago. Friedman, in an interview, has just expressed his intention to visit Santiago to see the miracle firsthand. A cohort of Chilean economists trained by Friedman and others, the Chicago boys, are in charge of the economy. Gunder Frank, in his letter, confronts all of them with no response. In passages, Gunder Frank recalls his own experience at Chicago, the way in which his questions and ideas were recurrently dismissed, and he was suggested to leave the program. He remembers the motto, "Science is measurement," inscribed on the walls of the social sciences building, and Friedman's advice to his students not to read to inform themselves about the world, but to focus instead on learning about measuring tools. The 1973 coup in Chile, with US support, served to introduce the most radical neoliberal reforms. Gunder Frank acknowledges his former mentor as the author of the program, and the Chicago boys and Pinochet with his troop of assassins, he says, as Friedman's executors and executioners. Chile, for people like Friedman, was an experiment. They succeeded, and their model spread around the world. A combination of neoclassical economics, coup d'etat, tanks, and torture lies at the foundation of the neoliberal boom. What was the role of political science in this process, though? Was Chile also an experimental field for our discipline? Until reading The Politics of Political Science, I never asked these questions. Surely I often think of Henry Kissinger, of his role in the Operation Condor, its death camps, the disappearance, and the hundreds of millions of the poor that the neoliberal experiment left. But I think of Kissinger as a criminal, not as a scholar in our discipline. Regarding us in South America, as Paulo writes, political science is supposed to be new, fully developed only in democracy. We are innocent, aren't we? Still, as if connected by the immortal Kissinger, as if visiting the world of the story El Otro Cielo by Julio Cortázar, Reading this book, I found myself bouncing back and forth between times and places with a persistent experience of déjà vu, struggling to find substantive differences between what Paulo describes as authoritarian political science and mainstream political science today. In other words, I think the reason why the parallel between thinking and killing struck me is because this is about the present, not just about the past. Let's see, one recurrent question in the book is the way in which hegemonic definitions of democracy speak of the politics of the discipline. In Pinochet's Chile, those in the field of authoritarian political science developed the notion of protected democracy. It was a productive period, Paulo shows, including an intense exchange with European and US academics. Aligned with the capitalist West in the Cold War, the Chileans imagined democracy as fragile and as under threat. Democracy was endangered by those pushing to expand it into new realms, from the household to social institutions, as if people could decide about everything. To say democracy, these scholars argued, stability and order must be prioritized, as must the absolute principles of the market and private property, which are seen as a synonym with freedom. Thus, capitalism stands as the uncontested limit of democracy, a limited liberal democracy. Schumpeterian, individualistic, centered on markets and property and driven by competition, this is how authoritarian political science imagines democracy. On its part, loyal to its own projections, authoritarian political science celebrates empiricism and neutrality, quantification, formal methods, and instruments in ways that echo Friedman's description of science referred by Gunther Frank. Just like the economists he describes, liberal political scientists imagine isolated, ahistorical, selfish, and competitive individuals at the foundation of society, and scientists as neutrally observing and modeling what these individuals do. The constitutive role of social and power relations, the critique of entrenched, exploitative, and justifiable hierarchies, the role of reflection and critical thinking are all gone. Uruguay was different, Paulo shows, as political science only developed during democracy. Yet the same positivist and neoliberal ideals prevail. Both in Chile and Uruguay, political science helped to expel socialism, Marx in particular, from acceptable vocabulary, in ways that makes them ignore or dismiss, mocked as outdated or as a no scientific, like they just write essays, even as authoritarian, that we hear Marx is. Within this liberal perspective, stylized fictional representations of US political science help to determine what is desirable and acceptable. An idealized model of the discipline in the US organizes standards and helps to place people alongside hierarchies of power. If mostly mainstream, this academic imperialism includes little niche for critical theory. Treated as luxury items, those products do for political science what the thriving art market does for the otherwise trite world of Wall Street. In 1984, returning to Argentina from his exile in Mexico, Juan Carlos Marin describes the academic absence of Marx and how entire debates and research agendas were gone. Not only people, but also discourses and programs had then disappeared. State terror, Marin argues, was behind. The politics of political science helps us to interrogate the role of our discipline in dismantling socialist politics and traditions of critical thinking. In addition, whether out of support or fear, both in Chile and Uruguay, political science diluted their dictatorships' many crimes. While the Chileans treated the military as saviors, the Uruguayans oscillated between a pragmatic silence under the logic of facts and justifying state crimes in the name of democracy. In all cases, political science in these two countries helped the exceptionalization of abuse and impunity. To conclude, the protected democracy that right-wing Chileans political science theorized and their way of thinking about themselves are basically the liberal democracy and the mainstream political science we have today. Sure, there's room for interpretivism or queer theory, but aren't those the little concessions that the victor can afford? I'm left wondering to what extent the Chilean experiment contributed to define the traits of both. Were Chilean and later Uruguayan political scientists merely appropriating pre-existent forms of power and knowledge, or they contributed to their development in ways that are relevant globally today? It would seem that it took military dictatorships and state terror to impose and to persuade about the virtues of narrow forms of liberal democracy and positivist political science. The political science that Paulo characterizes as authoritarian looks quite like mainstream political science today. Through the play of thinking, killing, and unthinking, peoples around the world have continued to be terrorized on behalf of the neoliberal democracy that Chile's Pinochet and apparently also our discipline contributed to build. This is how I've been thinking of your book, Paulo, wondering about the place of the Chilean and Uruguayan political science more broadly in the discipline, as of political science's role in the brutal victories and exclusion of neoliberalism, which have been made even more clear during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermina. Well, as I expected would be the case, by the time that it's my turn to speak, many people have addressed some of the things that I wanted to comment on. So excuse me if I seem like I'm just repeating some of the excellent points that some of you have already made. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about how I've used Paulo's book in my own teaching and advising. I teach in a small PhD program, and it's there that I've found Paulo's book to be most helpful to what I want to express, but also to my students. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. And most recently, in a seminar that I teach on the history of political science as a discipline, I had my students read Paulo's analysis in chapter 2 of political science in Chile under the Pinochet regime. And I think what's really important and valuable about that for students in the US is to see not only what he develops there, that there was, you know, a substantial authoritarian political science in Chile, but one that was also bolstered and nourished by academics from the US. And I think that's a hugely important case for students in the US to learn about. I teach it as part of a unit where I'm presenting students with cases that really historicize what modernization means or what political development means. And I'm very grateful to have his book help me do that. I also use his book in my grad seminar on democratic theory, in which I think he's showing in both chapter 2 and chapter 3 that even though democracy is so foundational a concept for political science, it's also highly malleable. And the way in which it gets expressed and defined is strikingly different in different contexts. And I think the juxtaposition, as some of you have already said, of the Chilean case with the Uruguayan case is really good at communicating that. Also, outside of my classes, I've recommended Paulo's book to some graduate students who really seem to struggle with the methodological strictures that US political science imposes on them. And both Robert and Thibaud already touched on this, but I wanted to talk about it just as sort of an element of the advice that I give students and how I use Paulo's book as part of that. I really offer it to students as an example of how the methods section, which people who are trying to write a dissertation in the US really hate and dread, I offer it as an example that that doesn't need to be a place where you grit your teeth and do a lot of anxious by the numbers rule following. But it can be instead, as I think Paulo's book really shows, and both Robert and Thibaud expressed this well, Paulo's book really shows how that area can be a place of real intellectual exploration and creativity. And I think it's a sad commentary on the way in which the discipline is taught and experienced by many people in the US, that in and of itself seems like an impossibility. It's like, what? I can be creative, and that can be the area where I really express myself intellectually in the methods section. Are you kidding? But I think that Paulo's book is a really good example of how that can be done. And truth be told, when I was thinking about elaborating this comment, I thought, a lot of authors really are creative in that area, but they don't really know how to talk about it. And especially what they don't seem to know how to talk about is to say how what they were creative about in the way that they employed their methods is really the heart of their intellectual project. But I think Paulo's really good at that. Paulo's book does that. And that's why it seems to me to be so valuable for people who are embarking on their first major intellectual project, and also for people who are thinking about going in a new direction and not doing things in the way that they've done them in the past. So I now want to move on to commenting on one particular area of Paulo's analysis of political and social studies in Uruguay that overlaps with some of my own work on the history of the social sciences in the US. In a part of chapter 3, Paulo critically analyzes what he calls an epic narrative that celebrates the role of private research centers in Uruguay that kept the political and social studies alive during the dictatorship. But Paulo, after he presents that narrative to acquaint us with it, also pushes back against it and tells us that he doesn't want to agree that these centers should simply be praised for keeping critical consciousness alive. Instead, one of the things that he says is he wants to focus on the disciplining role of the need to search for funding that he thinks these entities first modeled. And what's significant to me about Paulo's point is that he's saying this was not only true of these research centers when they were operating under the dictatorship, but that these effects, this way of being a political scientist, searching after funding, carried over into political science that emerged after the dictatorship ended. So in this way, the way that these research centers operated under the dictatorship sort of became the model for how to be a political scientist later. I've seen a similar dynamic in my own work on US political science, although of course it unfolded under very different circumstances. In my own work, it's also true that people who were working at research centers on the margins of the academy were driven at first by necessity to pursue funding. But later in the 20th century, that very way of being entrepreneurial, of constantly, being on the lookout or on the prowl for more grant money, became definitive of what it means to be a good, active political scientist. And I guess I'd like to just use that comparison because I think that it's found in different contexts to pose the question to Paulo, how do you make sense of the endurance of these strategies? And what enabled that strategy not just to die off as like a pragmatic thing that people did to survive under the dictatorship, but really allowed it to become sort of foundational for political scientists in Uruguay after the dictatorship fell? Just a question to pose to you. Now, I'd like to close by just raising another question about a few passages in the book that I found really striking and I must say also moving. in several places in the book, I think Paulo notes quite rightly that if one adopts a critical posture towards political science, that need not, and indeed should not, mean adopting a cold, censorious attitude of, as he puts it on page 181, rejection or resentment. And I think Paulo really illustrates that well. His analysis of the blind spots and shortcomings, particularly of Uruguayan political scientists, really shows how it's possible to have a critical attitude towards one's subjects that can also be generous and even empathic. But here's my question. At several important moments in this book, especially at the end of chapter 1, and then in another section in chapter 4, Paulo goes further and raises the temperature, to use his image, of the emotional stance that he takes towards political science. And he tells us towards the end of chapter 1 that he means to celebrate it. And then even more strikingly, in chapter 4, he says that the work that he's done is done for the love of political science. So in closing, I guess I would just like to ask Paulo to expand on how the critical spirit that animates his book can be big enough and expansive enough to include both celebration and even the love of its object.
All right.
Now we'll hear from Paulo.
Okay, I'm gonna stay small. I hope that's okay. I mean, I'm talking about the image, so I can see your faces while I speak. In one conversation with psychoanalysts about the book, I mentioned that in my perspective, when gratitude can appear is because anxiety is losing ground. And I really wanted to be present today and to absorb the gift that is that you read what I wrote and to listen carefully to the comments. So I didn't prepare anything. I just came with this. And I really want to savor this moment, and that meant to sort of put my OCD tendencies kind of aside as much as I could. Okay, so I'm gonna go straight to the engagement. Robert, I thank you so much for talking about epistemological plurality of pluralism. That's very key in the book and for what I want to do. And I love that you talked about pluralism of reactions and that and those different moments in the engagement and that range of intellectual responses. You also talked about pleasure, which I really want to emphasize that academia, and sometimes I feel that when we talk about academia, we sort of, even in critical circles, we take it for granted, and sometimes we locate real critique or action or pleasure somewhere else. And I truly believe that we need to reclaim it as much as we can. And I mean, the joy of thinking and the joy of writing, and that's something that for me it's important, because I really don't separate that process of thinking from our lives, and that's something that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Critique also appeared in your comments, and I conceptualize critique as a form of gratitude, actually, as the opposite of negation. And I think that in many conversations in academia, critique and negation are equated, and that's very unfortunate because it's in order to be able to actually engage with the other, we obviously, like, negation and hate are are barriers to that, right? Are barriers, and sometimes it's strange because when we talk about critique, it's conflated with something that you hate. We critique what we don't like, and I think it's, in some ways, that's sad. Okay, so the issue of knowledge and political, and one of the advantages of being completely unprepared is that I can kind of create a dialogue between you guys, and Terrell kind of answered that issue so beautifully. I don't need to do anything. It's just what I like. If that quote kind of encapsulates a way of being a Marxist, quote unquote, I am there. In some other ways, I'm not there at all. But in that, I feel so profoundly identified with that quote, that in what way, like, and also I find it interesting that in some liberal commentary, when we talk what is political, you start talking about things that are awful, like lying, or like, like politics becomes political because it becomes harmful, and it's the opposite of truth. And I'm like, in what way is political for me? Because it's about human activity. Like, the vaccine changes something in our body. The vaccine, it's like a material force and that material force is distributed in different ways and is manufactured in ways. I mean, it's so, like, what I mean by political doesn't mean that it's not the opposite of truth, or truth doesn't matter, because the fact that truth is constructed doesn't mean that any truth has the same value, because there are different ways of producing narratives in the world. Some of them are more reasonable than others. That is not pluralization doesn't mean that anything is equal, right? So in what way I mean that knowledge is political? Because it's producing the world, and because it's in the sort of networks of our encounters, and in that way it's political. And of course, this is not a liberal conception of politics, or like that it's encapsulate or more encapsulate in a particular realm of experience, right, of the political system of the state, or well, different as opposed to civil society, or as opposed to the markets. I don't think on those terms, because in critical theory, we think more in terms of relationships, right? Like those divisions are a problem in itself. Then the depoliticization, from this perspective, is a political intervention, right? However, the fact that knowledge has a political dimension doesn't mean that it's reduced to ideology. Like, the argument is that knowledge has an ideological dimension, a subjective dimension, and we become more rigorous when we understand that, and when we talk about it and we explore that. But that doesn't mean that catharsis, let's say, is knowledge production, that or like just ideology is knowledge production. So the way, and it's for me so fascinating, and Thibaud talked about this, how difficult it is for people to respond to chapter 4 and to the personal stuff, and that's the very personal. And I find it interesting because there is either, like, people feel that they have to talk about the abuse and say something, or there is silence, right? And between those the same with ideology, there is the possibility of putting that material to work analytically, and I think that can be so powerful. And when personal material, for instance, shows up, should I try to put it at work, because it's about others. It's not about me. It's not a self absorbed exercise. That's in a way the opposite. And I think that subjectivism, like a sort of uncontrolled subjectivity, and objectivity, or the totalization of objectivity, are actually very connected. They are very similar in some ways. Like hysterical screaming, screaming subjectivity is very, in some ways, kind of similar to like the wall of objectivity. Those are ways of hiding. Anyway, so I also liked your take on pluralizing the politics of political science. I like it. I don't mind liberals. I don't like, or a liberal take on it. And I would love to see that. And I believe that, I truly believe that authoritarianism and dogmatism is a democratically distributed thing. It's one of the very few things that are actually well distributed. And I don't think, it really bothers me is when there is this idea that liberalism monopolizes the discourse around freedom, or like only liberals are not dogmatic. And I think that there is a lot of violence on that. And I think that even the narrative that you presented about kind of Trump, or that is, half of the story. There is a lot of grievances and a lot of, I truly believe that the far right has a moment of truth that we need to listen to, and the liberal establishment has some responsibilities around what's going on. And so that's the role of introspection. And so, but long story short, like what I mean is that any perspective is limited. Any perspective illuminates and obscures problems, even mine. And what I think I conceptualize self-reflection as a way of trying not to abuse others. So how am I with time? Because I just went through. I can't hear Emily. Emily, we don't hear you.
I think you've been speaking for around 10 minutes.
Oh my God, okay. I was going to talk about the Thibaud and and everyone, but
so no, by my computer clock, it's 44. So why don't you go until 50? And then we'll still have time for questions, yeah?
Okay. Yeah, let me see how I do this, because I'll try to go to the critical part then, just. The comparative politics I mentioned, this is a Thibaud comment. Yeah, so the book has, the core of the book is critical theory, and then there is and it's an exercise, right? It doesn't try to, it's just an exercise. And that's a dialogue with authors that I love and I read for many, many years. The comparative politics study is kind of inserted into this exercise around epistemology and that. And I think that it works, because what I do is to look at countries that are very similar, with similar outputs but different outputs at the same time, which is that one had authoritarian political science with some very specific implications. And that part of the book I can actually isolate and show how there is a comparative politics exercise there. The no empathy, that's a fascinating comment that you made, and thank you so much. And yes, I wanted to treat those political scientists a little bit as mice, like a little bit of rats in the laboratory, to show, to kind of resemble the violence of the objective gaze, and to embody that for a little while, and showing how and that is necessary sometimes. So I'm not one to reject that kind of epistemological procedure, but I wanted to resemble it, and sort of there's a little bit of quiet satire there, like showing, like it's a playful thing. Then, well, yeah, I think I'm more or less more. Oh yeah, and then I truly believe that there is a neoconservative cultural formation that was academic, that was this kind of political science, and I really immersed myself in that world, and it was fascinating. And yeah, and I think that there is such a thing as authoritarian political science. And Terrell, I love the fact that you talked about this is an intervention, an exercise. Not to the point of I don't want the reader to break out with me, to leave, right? To be so like, and I try to like you just, I mean, I just love what you said, and you actually kind of talked about the book in ways that kind of respond to a lot of the questions, and then this notion was there, but I think that any perspective has a conceptual political economy of violence, right? So it illuminates and some problems, and it's limited. So that's why I emphasize the notion of this is an exercise. This is not. It's an experimentation. It's like yeah. Okay, Guillermina, I really loved. I think that you talked about part of the heart of the book. My obsession, and that's why chapter 4 is so important, is our own participation in oppression, mine as well. So that's why I put the example of a communist who in my particular environment was seen as a hero who abused me, but then my temptation to abuse him through my writing. So the ethical treatment of a perpetrator, because we can become oppressors, because when we have wounds, the wounds can be weaponized so easily. And I think that's truly about democratic engagement. And you talked about how this thing, right? Like how our own participation and how protected democracy, that little crazy notion of these fascists actually traveled so much, because this idea that we have to be fearful of the masses, and that's entrenched. It's not just, it's entrenched. I mean, we see that in the Federalists, we see that, like, it's not in liberal, like, thought, and that's, that might be a reasonable idea, but the way that it's resolved in this fascist thinking really traveled to liberal political science. And I didn't think what it was fascinating for me how you kind of made it travel even more than I expected. But this internalization of fear, I think that is okay. Emily, and I'm almost done. Democracy is malleable. Like now I'm working on the far right a lot, and one of the things that with my co-author, we say a lot is, when it's very interesting to see the judgment that when even scholars who are supposed to be, that there are some objects that we can judge so harshly and so easily, and there is no problem, and there are some little communities in which we are on the right side of history, therefore we are not oppressors, we are clean, we are innocent. And then there are these monsters, right? And we are making a lot of effort to show, for instance, how in Latin America the far right is talking about democracy, because it's important, and it's, I mean, in new ways, not just it's not the Chileans, it's new, they talk about gender ideology and new things, and to try to understand it. And we cannot understand what we don't respect. And one of the things that I think it's very important for me, and it has been important for me to understand in my life, is that abuse is inhumane, but it's profoundly human, and that it's a dynamic that is not of the other, right? And so democracy, let's say, democracy is malleable, like it appears in different ways, and if we are not dogmatic, we can hear how others what others mean by that. And yes, then we will have to confront, we will have to like fight probably in some cases, and that's fine. But that moment of openness that is so fundamental, not to become oppressive oneself. So thank you so much for your words about the work with PhD students and this idea of feeling the method. Like I really had fun intellectually doing the book, and yeah, I fear that when you talked about how you use your book with your students, I thought you were going to say, don't do this. and I also will understand that, because there is a lot of fear, right? Like your work is not going to be accepted, or it's going to be anyway. And finally, the comments around the research centers. So the research centers, and they were precarious small centers. It was not like kind of what happened probably in the US is a little bit different. But that, and Thibaud mentioned this about being relentlessly critical, and that I like that, and it implies, I think, to always try to see a little bit, to kind of go a little bit deeper about what's going on, trying to put critique there where it hurts, even when it hurts me. But for me, there was this, even in my close circle, like this idea that these people, of course, dictatorship, academics who lost their job, and they had these little centers, and the idea, and I understand it, and I share it, the idea that these people kept thinking alive. Fine, I'm fine with that. Sometimes I think that critique doesn't mean to sort of oppose to everything, that it's just to look at it in a different way, right? So yeah, I saw how, I mean, these people protected thinking, but at the same time, there was a huge ideological shift, a huge epistemological shift, which was also a subjective shift. These people suffered the dictatorship. They learned how important democracy is, and that learning is legitimate. But it's a traumatic learning. There is learning that is traumatic, right? So that was internalized. And what is fascinating is that after the political economy of the centers shifted, and the public university in Uruguay came back and became again the main institution, that logic, even though the reality was very different, that logic persisted. And finally, the celebration, love, and the plurality. And I already mentioned that resentment is the opposite of critique, but this is a tricky one, the love. I think that because I guess the other has so many moments, and so many, and the past and time, right? It's so plural, and the engagements and the encounters did very different things. So when if I look at some of the instances of homophobic mocking, or like instances that really had a legacy in myself of anxiety, and like each time I'm going to speak in a space like this, I get super nervous. I mean, it's really like big time, like big impact. At the same time, there was so much love and care in the same space, and sometimes by the same people. That's I think that, and this is, for me, is theoretical too. Like to understand the plurality of meaning of the same thing. How, for instance, something can oppress and liberate at the same time. Like how Marx looked at capitalism and says, "Oh, this is for like in some occasions." This, I mean, it's a force of progress and a force that can damage, and the damage and even love, which is it's a word that in political science is kind of weird, but love is damaging. I mean, and yeah, and those two things of care and carelessness, or that plurality, it's also something important. And I think that it's a way of not totalizing the other in terms of, I don't want to, I'm genuinely not resentful with the discipline. It's the opposite. I love it. And there are all those other moments, right? And yeah, so thank you for that question, and stop here. I'm sorry, I couldn't manage myself with the time.
Well, I think if anyone is entitled to go over time in a roundtable, it's the author of the book who's under discussion. But we do have a lot of participants here. I'm thinking that it might be best to type your comments in the room chat. That way, not just I, but everyone can see your comments. There's also a raise hand function. We on the panel can't see it, but if you're an attendee, it's to the right of the full screen icon at the top of your page. So Paulo, can you see the question in the room chat? I assume that most of the questions are going to be to you.
I can, yeah.
Yes, and there are several. Can everyone on the panel see the questions as well under the room chat? Okay.
Yeah. Should I answer, or how should we proceed? Yeah, she's saying yes, I think. We can't hear you, but yes. Okay. All right. Yeah.
The first question's addressed to you, and
Yeah, and then
questioners, if you could just make it clear who you want to answer, but I assume you're going to be wanting Paulo's.
Yeah. Okay. So Satadru, sorry if I destroying your name. Yeah, I was very. It's interesting how the relationship between different knowledges operate in the history of political science in Latin America. So on the one hand, political science despised its mother, like sociology in a way, and there was like this illegitimate uterus, sort of, I don't know if that's a word in English, but the illegitimate sort of source and that was related to the relationship with Marxism, because sociology in the 60s was really inhabited or almost, some people say that dominated by sociology. I think it's an exaggeration, but and the relationship with economics is very different. So that's what your question is about. There is it's different because on the one hand there is separation between politics and the economy. So politics have to respect the logic of the economy, of the market economy, of the market, and that's. But at the same time, economics is introduced in political science as the most prestigious way of talking about politics. So that double move is fascinating: separation and integration that is subordinated from the point of view of political science. So, and I think that we, and I mean, I know this sounds very ideologically charged, but the very notion of a rational subject that is self-interested, and there is a lot of devices there that have implications of how we think about politics. And in some circles, you even mentioned this, and it's like you are, it's kind of out of the place, right? It's completely impertinent. But I think that has like kind of huge impacts, and we need to discuss it. And then the one on orthography, so I'm now the editor of a journal. It's called the Journal of Narrative Politics, and we discuss a lot about how to evaluate, for instance, a text that is autoethnographic. And it's a fascinating question, and it can be so rigorous in a way, and so open and rigorous at the same time. I love that conversation. And what I see in the world of orthonography three risks that I'm very interested in. One is the attachment to innocence, which is this the author becoming as the hero, or like lack of self critique that is not really that that in the praxis of the writing it becomes just, you know, an indictment of someone else. And that happens a lot when we bring subjectivity into the conversation. The other risk of narrative approaches, I think, is the attachment to trauma. Like, trauma can be an amazing tool to explore and to open up problems, but it can be also something that it just reproduces itself through the writing and doesn't do anything new, and it's just about exposing. And exposure for the sake of exposure really leaves us all alone. The author that didn't do anything theoretical or interesting and didn't give anything to the other. So that I think that, and then I think that another risk, and I'd like to talk about risks because we have been talking about the potentials of this and disputing kind of the perspectives that dismiss this approach. I think it can be really powerful, but I think that we need to talk about the risks, because the more I read work like that self-identifies as narrative, it's like, okay, let's talk about the risk. So and the last risk, so attachment to innocence, attachment to trauma, is the sort of moralizing denial of complexity. So in a lot of critical scholarship, there are these actors or subjects that are unquestionable. So the queer subject, the disabled, the people of color, little communities fighting against some evil transnational mining company. I mean, and then it becomes just sort of, I mean, doesn't produce knowledge, right? So for orthonography, I think orthonography is amazing. I think that I used it in the book, and I've seen wonderful, recent, like, wonderful texts that really open up problems in ways that they're just amazing, but it has also its limitations. And I also, like, I always, in some circles, I always talk about the importance of positivism, like the importance of, like, when you depart for something, you really need to know that something and to respect it too. And I think that go through it, it's very important. So orthonography is dangerous. I think it's amazing. It gives, but it has, sometimes it becomes a little bit problematic too.
I hope you all can see that the next question posed by Peter Wagner was, at least in principle, opened to all of us. I don't know if anyone has a ready answer to offer. I certainly don't, so I'm going to punt on this one. But if someone else would like to give Paulo a short break and offer some thoughts on whether a post-American century will be liberating, have at it.
I mean, I'm willing to give it a go. I mean, the question is liberating for whom, right? And so surely it will be liberating for some, and I expect it will be profoundly unliberating for others. Maybe the interesting question is, will it be liberating for political science, right? So we think that political science can actually flourish in the context of a variety of different types of political regimes. what does that mean for the types of political science that could and will develop and feel liberated to express themselves in the decades to come, and what forms of political science will feel dismissed as, oh, no one thinks that anymore. So if in the Uruguayan context in 2000 people are just dismissive of socialism, then I feel within 5-10 years people will be the same dismissiveness towards the kind of liberal ideology of the 90s. Say, how could anybody ever believed that, right? So clearly, like, some forms of knowledge within political science will have their cachet decline, and others will rise. That's my initial take.
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts. This is a great question. Just thinking about this question through my reading of Paulo's book. On the one hand, images that come to mind. The Europeans, and a number of European scholars collaborated with the Chileans during the dictatorship. So it's not that, I mean, Americans, and I'm in both worlds, right, in South America and in the US, but it's not to excuse the American political science, but the fact that someone else becomes the hegemon doesn't guarantee any emancipation per se. And the other thing I think I would use from Paulo's book would be, well, it all depends on the room that it gives to practices such as self-reflection, right? Because, someone else may become dominant and still inherit these dogmatic forms of truth. And only to the extent that we can really promote critical thinking and dialogue and self-reflection, and in terms of not just for the subjectivism, right, but to be truthful and honest about our own relations to power. I think that could make us better.
We're getting pretty close to the end of our session. So Paulo, I know this is not going to be an easy task, but if you wouldn't mind looking at the last two questions that have been posed, I think there's, and they're not, I'm not saying that they're the same, but I think that they can be perhaps addressed together if you can try to manage that.
Sure. Yeah. So I thank you, Marcela, and also Abdul Nasir. Apologies, I usually destroy names. I think that they can be responded at the same time. I think that one way of looking at this, and like Terrell's book that we discussed yesterday was so important to me in terms of thinking about genre instability and how activity can help us to understand how we make things and how we are made things, and so our engagements, our encounter really depend on that, like on its human activity, right? And there are these spaces that have been built in particular ways, and those spaces shouldn't be dismissed because they allow things and they don't allow other things. And that kind of reflexive engagement with things, I think that epistemology in that way is truly heuristical and truly powerful to understand the world. It's not just a kind of meta, narrative or so. I believe that attitude really resists simplification, and I think that if I have to put in very shortly what I one of the things that I'm obsessed, and probably when I get older and more mature, I'm going to change my obsession. So, I mean, I'm not saying that this is what I am now. Is this obsession with the ubiquitous, can I say that? Or like the ubiquitous presence of simplification and like that, including myself, and including like, it's not a thing of who is the one who is not going to do that, and it's not about imagining that some people can get it, but it's to inhabit those moments of simplification that can be so violent, kind of destabilizing that, and that's it, and how we are all involved in oppressive practices, and oppression is not outside, and as Marcela says, so for the first question is the resistance against simplification. I think that's very important, really important. And I really see a lot of failure around that, like in political science. And that's something that we should be, like, I see a lot of colleagues sometimes saying things as if this the way. And it's like, no, like there are other ways of looking at this, right? And the oppressed can oppress. And that's super important to think about. And that's something I try to argue in chapter 4. Emancipatory projects, when they become unreflexive, they become dogmatic and oppressive. And that's, yeah. So I think in political science, it's really important. And the classroom, I see the classroom as a site for so much possibility in that regard. Yeah, like spend time with the students and unpacking these issues. I think it's a gift, and yeah.
Could I jump in there, Emily, just for a couple of seconds? There's a bit of a dialectic, if I can be allowed the term, here between simplification, reductionism, and various kinds of things that people are taught to do and are rewarded to do. And I'll go back to the first page of chapter 1, which has the word complex there and relationality. And of course, relationality is really the kind of opposite side of let's draw clear boundary lines, have clear distinctions. What are you doing to say in the genre? And that's why one of the reasons why the book is so usefully disturbing. My own introduction actually was I was privileged to read chapter 4 in draft, and that is really the outer edge, or where political science and academics and social science, social studies, any of those things, even literary studies, don't want to go. Something that's really deeply personal, deeply upsetting, deeply troubling, and unresolved. And I think that's such a mirror of the human condition. So thank you for that, for getting this into a book with political science on the title. And it's wonderful to see it being enjoyed and used. Thank you.
Well, I think we're now up to 11:15, which I guess is the time that our session is supposed to end. I hope, Paulo, you've seen all of the thank yous from a number of questioners that were put in the room chat. I think this worked as well as something on this virtual platform could have. So thank you to all of you for taking the time and participating in such a direct and honest and generous way.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, Paulo.
And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.